The first frost of the season had silvered the gravel of Harrowgate's great court when the Duke of Wexmoor stepped down from his carriage and looked at the woman holding the door, and did not know her. She stood with her gloved hands folded against the cold, a housemaid in grey wool with a clean white cap, her face composed into the practiced blankness of service. He passed within a foot of her. His eyes moved across her as they moved across the boot scraper in the iron rail and the snow beginning to settle on the stone. Nothing in him paused. To him she was furniture made of breath, a fixture of the house he had purchased with the title, and he climbed the steps without a backward glance. She watched him go. Her hands did not shake. Her heart, though, had stopped on the word he had not said, the name he had once known, and she understood in that single passing moment that the man who had carried her out of a burning stable 9 years ago had forgotten her entirely. Her name was Clara Bramwell, and she was 26 years of age. And she had not forgotten him. Stay with me. Because what the world had decided about this quiet woman was about to be undone slowly in the only place that had ever mattered to her. To the household at Harrowgate, she was simply the upper housemaid who kept the east wing, a quiet creature who never overstepped and never asked. The housekeeper, Mrs. Penhallow, valued her precisely because she made herself small. The footman forgot her between rooms. The new Duke had inherited the estate 8 months prior. Upon the death of a distant cousin he had met perhaps twice, and he had brought with him a coldness the servants felt in the corridors before they ever saw his face. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. A man who has decided to feel nothing is far more frightening than a man who shouts. Clara had learned this when she was 17 and watched everything she had ever owned turn to smoke, and so she recognized it in him at once, the way one recognizes a language one has been forbidden to speak. The other servants gave him the wide berth. One gives whether, Mrs. Penhallow, who had served 3 masters at Harrowgate, and outlasted 2, said only that the new Duke was a fair man and a cold one, and that the 2 things did not cancel each other out. The footman laid wagers on whether he would marry within the year and to whom. With Maid. Clara laid no wagers, and offered no opinions, and kept her east wing as though the keeping of it were a vow. And in the keeping, she watched him more closely than anyone in that house, and understood him better than anyone in that house, and let no one, least of all the man himself, suspect that she did either. She had owned things. Once, her father had been the steward of a modest estate in Hampshire. A careful man, with ink-stained fingers and a small library he loved more than he loved comfort. He had taught her to read 3 languages, and to keep accounts, and to look a difficult truth directly in the face, without flinching. Then a lamp had been left burning in the stable on a dry August night, and the fire had taken the house and the library and her father with it. Her father had been a careful man in all things, and the carelessness had not been his, and that, more than the loss itself, was the part Clara had never been able to set down. A groom had left a lantern hung too near the straw. The straw had been dry as paper after a rainless month. The whole of a good and ordered life had been undone by a single thoughtless act of another person, and there had been no one to hold to account, no villain to name, only the ordinary stupidity of the world, which is the hardest kind of grief to carry because it cannot be aimed anywhere. And Clara had been carried out of the smoke by a young man in a scorched riding coat who had been passing on the road and had not stopped to consider his own safety. She had been half conscious. She had seen only the line of his jaw against the orange sky, and felt only the strength of the arms that did not let her fall. He had set her down on the cool grass beyond the gate, said 3 words she had kept for 9 years, and ridden on before anyone could learn his name. The 3 words had been spoken low almost to himself as he laid her down, and she had been too far gone to be certain she had heard them rightly, and had turned them over in the dark of every year since, until they were worn smooth as a river stone. Hold on now. That was what she had decided. He had said, hold on now. She had held on. Through the charity of distant relations who made her feel the charity in every meal, through the slow descent from a steward's educated daughter to a lady's companion to, at the last, a housemaid in grey wool. She had held on, and she had never once been able to say to herself with any honesty why, except that a stranger in a scorched coat had told her to, and then vanished into the dark before she could thank him or refuse. She had spent the years since learning it the slow way, through gossip and almanacs and the careful study of faces, and she had been certain, the way the body is certain, the moment the new Duke stepped down into the frost. He did not know her. That was the wound, though she would not have called it that. The world had a great deal of practice in not knowing Clara, and she had a great deal of practice in being unknown. She was good at it. She was the best at it she had ever been. He found her the next morning in the long gallery, on her knees, with a cloth, working the grime of a generation from the carved foot of a cabinet that no one had touched in years. She had not heard him enter. He stood in the doorway with the winter light behind him, and watched her hands move, the small, precise circles, the way she paused to breathe on a piece of tarnished brass before she polished it bright. Most servants worked to be seen working. This one worked as though the cabinet itself deserved care, as though no one were watching, as though being unobserved were a kind of freedom rather than a kind of erasure. He did not understand why he had stopped. He told himself he had merely been crossing the gallery. He had not been crossing the gallery. There was nothing in the gallery he needed. When she rose and saw him and curtsied, her face went to its blankness, and something in him registered the change, like a door closing. He had seen the other face. He could not have said what it was, only that for a moment a person had been kneeling there, and now a function stood in her place. "You need not stop," he said. His voice was level and low, the voice of a man who had not needed to ask for anything in years. "Continue." It was a command. She heard the command. She did not hear, because she could not yet permit herself to hear, the thing folded inside it, which was that he had not wanted her to make herself small in front of him. She knelt again. He left. In the doorway he paused, half a breath, and then was gone. And Mrs. Penhallow found Clara a moment later, still kneeling, the brass already bright, her hands still moving over it in circles, though there was nothing left to polish. The Dowager Marchioness of Ardennes arrived at Harrogate 3 days before Christmas, and the temperature of the house dropped by 10 degrees in a manner that had nothing to do with the weather. She was the late cousin's sister, and she had appointed herself the guardian of what the title ought to mean, and she traveled with a lady's maid, 4 trunks, and her granddaughter, Miss Honoria Vane, who was 19 and lovely in the manner of a porcelain figure that has never once been dropped. The dowager surveyed the entrance hall, the servants arranged in their line, and the new Duke at the foot of the stair, and she let her gaze pass over the staff the way one counts livestock. "They have let standards slip," she observed, to no one and to everyone. Her eyes found Clara and stopped, not from interest, but from the small irritation of an imperfection. That one. She has the look of a woman who has come down in the world. I cannot abide a servant with opinions in her face. Send her to the kitchens where her airs will trouble no one. She turned away. A maid with a history is a maid with grievances, Wexmore. Remember it, a maid with a history. The crowd of servants held its collective breath, eyes fixed on the marble. Mrs. Penhallow's mouth thinned. And Clara, who had spent 9 years making her face a closed door, felt the old heat climb her throat and stay there unspent, while her gloved hands pressed flat against her apron to keep themselves still. She had learned long ago that the cost of being seen was always paid by the one seen, never by the one looking. The Duke had not moved. "She keeps the east wing," he said. "She will continue to keep it. Nothing more." The dowager's lips compressed at the contradiction, slight as it was, and Honoria glanced between them with the quick calculation of a girl who has been raised to read a room for advantage. Clara stood with her eyes down and did not understand why her position had just been defended, and told herself it was only that the Duke disliked disruption to his household, and very nearly believed it. That evening she carried coals to the library, and found him there alone, in a wing chair before the fire, with a glass of brandy he had not touched. The room was the finest in the house. 2 stories of books rising into shadow, a ladder on a brass rail, the smell of leather and wood smoke and old paper that Clara had loved in her father's small library and had not let herself love since. She moved quietly to the hearth. She thought he was asleep. She was wrong. "You read," he said. Not a question. She froze with the scuttle in her hands. "I have watched you. You shelve the books by author and not by size, as the last man did. You straighten the ones left open, and you mark the page. First, a housemaid does not mark the page." He turned his head. In the firelight, his face was less stone than she had believed it. The discipline of it, visible as discipline. As a thing held, rather than a thing that came naturally. "Who taught you to read? That you do it as though the book might be taken from you." The honest answer would have undone her. "My father, your grace," she said. "He kept accounts." "And where is your father now?" "He is dead, your grace." She set down the scuttle. There was a fire. She did not see his hand tighten on the arm of the chair. She had turned to the hearth. Yet the fire showed her his reflection in the dark glass of the library window, and she saw the stillness come over him, total and sudden, the stillness of a man who has stepped without warning onto ground he thought was behind him. He said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, by a degree only she could have measured. "Go and warm yourself before you go up," he said. "It is cold in the passages. Eat something in the kitchen." That is an instruction. A command, again dominant and complete, and folded inside it, where she still could not let herself look. The only tenderness a man like him knew how to give. What the Duke of Wexmoor could not say, and would not say for some weeks yet, was that he had once ridden through Hampshire on the night a steward's house burned, and had carried a girl out of the smoke, and had spent 9 years failing to forget the weight of her, and the 3 words he had said and could no longer remember saying. He had told himself the girl had died. It was easier to grieve a stranger than to wonder. He had built his coldness around that, not knowing the way scar tissue builds around a splinter left too long in the flesh. He did not yet see Clara's face in the smoke. He saw only that this housemaid disturbed something in him he had paid a great deal, in silence and in solitude, to keep undisturbed. The miniature lived in the breast pocket of his coat. She had seen his hand go to it twice now, an absent gesture, a touch, and a withdrawal, and she had thought it a watch. It was not a watch. The days before Christmas filled the house with the machinery of the season. The dowager intended a ball, the first Harrogate had seen in a decade, and she intended it to announce to the county and to the Duke himself that Miss Honoria Vane was the obvious and only suitable match for a man of his position. The invitations went out in Honoria's careful hand. The estate was turned upside down. Clara worked from before dawn until after midnight, and in the rare seams of quiet, she felt the Duke's attention on her in a way she could not name, a question he kept not asking, a stillness that found her across crowded rooms. She told herself she imagined it. The body told her otherwise. The body that grew warm when his step sounded in a corridor, that knew the precise location of him in any room before her eyes confirmed it, that betrayed her with a quickened pulse at the cool of her own wrist, while her face stayed a closed and careful door. The witnessing came on the 4th day, though Clara did not know she had been witnessed. There was a boy among the underservants, a scullery lad of perhaps 10 named Tom, who had broken a serving dish of some value and stood white and shaking in the back passage, while the dowager's lady's maid threatened him with dismissal and the workhouse and worse. Clara came upon them. She did not raise her voice. She stepped between the boy and the woman, and said calmly that the dish had been cracked already, that she had noticed the flaw herself a week prior, that it was nobody's fault but Time's, and she said it with such steady certainty that the lie became unassailable. The lady's maid was a thin, sharp woman named Soames, who had come with the dowager's trunks and brought the dowager's opinion of the world with her, and she had the boy backed against the cold stone of the passage with the broken halves of the dish held up like evidence at an assize. Tom's chest heaved. He was 10 years old, and his father was dead, and his mother took in washing in the village, and the word workhouse had been said to him twice now, in a voice that meant it. Clara had heard the commotion from the still room, and come at once, drying her hands on her apron as she walked. And she put herself between the woman and the child with the unhurried certainty of someone who has decided the cost is worth paying, before she has finished counting it. She pressed her own week's wages into Mrs. Penhallow's keeping against the cost, quietly, so the boy would never know. Then she knelt and gathered the pieces with her bare hands, and told Tom to go and wash his face, and that no one good was ever measured by a broken plate. The Duke had been in the gallery above. He had seen all of it. He had seen the wages change hands. He stood at the balustrade in the shadow, and watched a woman with nothing give away what little she had to protect a child who could never repay her, and he felt the splinter shift in the old scar, and his hand went to his breast pocket, to the miniature before he knew it had moved, that she could not see. The dowager, descending the stair, saw the Duke's face turned down toward the passage, and followed his gaze, and understood, with the swift, cold arithmetic of her kind, exactly what she was looking at. She did not yet know who Clara was. She knew only that the Duke's attention had a direction, and that the direction was wrong, and that it would have to be corrected before the ball. The correction began as such things always do. In a private aside dressed as concern, the dowager found Clara polishing the long mirror in the morning room, and addressed her without turning her head. "You imagine he sees you," she said. "He does not. Men of his rank look at women like you, the way they look at a well-kept lawn. A pleasant impression of order. Nothing more." She adjusted her glove. "I have buried a husband and married off 3 daughters, girl. I know precisely what I am looking at when a great man's eye wanders below his station. It is not love. It is appetite. And appetite is corrected by marriage to a suitable woman. You are a passing weakness. Do not mistake yourself for a future." She left. Clara polished the mirror until her own reflection swam, and into the swimming glass she said nothing, and believed in the part of herself the world had trained every word. The escalating proximity ran through the week like a thread pulled tight. He found reasons. A book he wished reshelved that he could have reshelved himself. A question about the ordering of the library that no Duke needed a housemaid to answer. He spoke to her in the short level sentences of a man who did not know how to speak any other way, and she answered in the careful deflections of a woman who could not afford to be drawn, and the gap between them narrowed by a degree each day, and neither would name it. Once reaching past her for a volume on the high shelf, his hand came to rest beside hers on the rail. Not touching, a half-inch of cold air between his bare knuckles and her glove, and the half-inch held them both perfectly still for the length of 3 heartbeats, while the fire spoke quietly in the grate. He did not touch her. She did not move. The not touching was louder than any touch could have been. Then he stepped back and bade her good night, and his voice was not quite level, and she lay awake in her cold room beneath the eaves, and pressed her hand to her own wrist and felt her pulse and did not sleep. There were other evenings like it, through that long week. An evening when he asked her abruptly what she thought of a passage he had been reading, and listened to her answer as though her answer were a thing he had wanted rather than a thing he had idly requested, and did not correct her when she disagreed with him, and seemed, if anything, the more interested for it. An evening when she came in with the coals, and found him already gone, but a chair drawn up close to the hearth where no chair usually stood, as though he had sat there waiting, and grown tired of admitting to himself that he was waiting. She told herself these were the small disorders of a great house in the season. The wanting in her own chest told her they were not, and she silenced it, the way she had silenced everything else, by working until her hands ached and her mind went blessedly quiet. You may have guessed already what he had not. Hold the thought a moment longer. He held it 9 years. The wound's full shape came to her on the night before the ball, by accident, in the library, where so much of this had lived. He was not there. She had come to bank the fire. His coat lay across the back of the wing chair where he had left it, and as she lifted it to lay it more carefully aside, the weight of the breast pocket swung against her hand, and a small flat case slipped half from it and fell open on the seat of the chair. It was not a watch. It was a miniature, a painted portrait the size of a large coin, and the face in it was a girl of 17, with dark hair and a steady mouth and gray eyes that looked out of the ivory as though daring the painter to flinch. It was unmistakably a likeness of Clara. It had been painted from memory, imperfectly, the hair too long, and the jaw not quite right. But the eyes were hers, exactly hers. The eyes of the girl who had been carried out of the smoke and set down on the cool grass beyond the gate. On the back, in a hand pressed hard enough to scar the metal, 4 words. I did not stop. She stood holding the open case in the firelit dark, and understood everything at once and could not breathe. He had not forgotten her. He had carried her for 9 years. He had simply never known her name, never seen her face in daylight, and had built a girl from smoke and grief in a single night, and had carried the painted ghost of her over his heart while the living woman knelt at his hearth and polished his brass. He had ridden on that night, the 3 words still in the air, certain he had left a dying girl behind, and the not knowing had frozen him solid. She thought of the 8 months she had kept his east wing, the dozens of times she had passed within reach of him, and made herself a closed door, so that he should never have cause to look twice. The discipline she had built around her own certainty exactly as he had built his coldness around his doubt. They had each spent these months protecting the other from a recognition they were both starving for. She had believed herself forgotten. He had believed her dead. And the gap between those 2 beliefs was a half-inch of cold air on a brass rail, a face turned to a hearth, a name that neither of them had said aloud in the same room until tonight. And he had said, in paint on the back of her own face, the thing she had spent 9 years failing to hear him unsay. I did not stop. He had stopped. He had carried her out. He had only never learned that she had lived. She heard his step in the passage and barely had time to fold the case and lay the coat aside before he entered, and her face was wet, and for once she could not make it a closed door fast enough. He saw the tears. He saw the coat moved. He went very still. "What is it?" he said, and it was not a command, and that was how she knew the ground had shifted under both of them. From the corridor came the dowager's voice, calling for the Duke, the ball not 12 hours off, and the moment broke, and Clara curtsied and fled, and carried the whole shattering truth up the cold stairs alone. The ball filled Harrowgate with light. Every candle in the house was lit. The county came in carriages through the snow, the great families in their diamonds, and the ballroom that Clara had spent 2 days preparing blazed gold beneath chandeliers she had polished, link by link she was to serve. She stood at the edge of the room in her gray wool among the footmen, invisible again, watching Honoria move through the figures of the dance in white silk and pearls, watching the dowager arrange the evening like a general arranging a field, watching the Duke stand at the head of the room with his face like stone and his hand, twice, going to the breast pocket of a coat that was not the coat, for the miniature was upstairs where Clara had left it. The dowager had chosen her moment with care, as the music paused between dances. In the full hearing of the assembled county, she turned toward the edge of the room and let her voice carry. "Wexmore, your housemaid is staring at the dancing like a child at a sweet shop window. It is unseemly." A ripple of attention. Faces turning. This is precisely what comes of keeping a servant with a history and ideas above her station. A maid who has come down in the world never learns where she now belongs. The third voicing, in the cruelest setting of all, before 200 witnesses, and the crowd's murmur rose and fell like wind across a field, and every eye in that golden room found the woman in gray, and weighed her and dismissed her in a single glance. Clara stood in the full light with nowhere to hide, and her hands flat against her apron and her chin level, and she did the only thing left to a person stripped bare in public. She did not weep, and she did not flee. She lifted her eyes and looked, not at the crowd, but directly at the Duke, across the whole bright length of the room, and let him see, for the first time, and at last the face that was not a closed door. The face from the smoke. the face on the ivory over his heart. The Duke of Wexmore looked back at her, and the assembled county watched the color leave his face, and watched the stone of him crack straight down the middle in front of every soul who had ever been taught to believe that men like him did not break. He set down his glass. He did not hurry. He crossed the ballroom in 3 long strides through a crowd that parted without knowing why it parted, past Honoria in her white silk, past the dowager whose fan had stopped halfway to her face, and he stopped before the woman in gray wool, and the whole golden room held its breath. "It is you," he said, low only for her, and then he turned and said it for the room. He took Clara's gloved hand in both of his, there in the blaze of 200 candles, and he spoke the words into the silence the crowd had made. "This is the woman I carried from the fire." A murmur went through the room and died. Somewhere near the doors a glass was set down too hard. The dowager's mouth opened and produced nothing. The county, which had spent a decade hearing of the cold Duke of Wexmore, who felt nothing and wanted no one, stood in its diamonds and its silk, and watched the cold Duke of Wexmore hold a housemaid's gloved hand in both of his, as though it were the only warm thing in England. The silence held. No one breathed. Then he said the rest, short and level and irrevocable. The only sentence that could end the hierarchy's hold on her in that room before those witnesses. "I am going to marry her." No one spoke. The candles burned. For the length of a long-held breath, the whole bright room simply held. 200 people in 10,000 flames, and the snow falling unseen beyond the tall black windows. And into that silence, not one further word was added, because none was needed, because the thing had been said that could not be unsaid. The dowager's fan fell. It struck the parquet with a small, sharp sound that traveled the length of the silent room. "Wexmore," she said, and her polished voice fragmented on the single word. "You cannot. She is nothing. She is a maid with a history." Yet the county had already begun to understand what it was seeing, and an old woman near the window, a Mrs. Aldous who had known Hampshire in her youth, said clearly into the hush, "Bramwell, the steward's girl. They said she died." And the name moved through the room like the first crack across a frozen pond, and the verdict the dowager had spent a week building came apart in the time it took to say it. A gentleman by the orchestra set down his glass, untasted. 2 matrons who had been whispering behind their fans lowered them in unison, the whispering forgotten. A young lieutenant home on leave, who had stood all evening at the edge of things, straightened as though at an order he recognized. The musicians, uncertain, did not lift their instruments. And through the crowd ran the low, changed murmur of 200 people revising at once a thing they had been certain of an hour before. The sound a tide makes when it turns, when what had been pulling one way begins without anyone commanding it, to pull the other. Honoria, to the surprise of everyone who had decided in advance who she was, stepped back from the center of the floor of her own accord, and inclined her head to Clara, a small, correct gesture of a girl releasing a claim she had never truly wanted, and that small motion finished what the Duke's words had begun. The crowd's recognition gathered and turned, as crowds do, toward the truth once it can no longer be denied. The dowager stood alone in the middle of it, her arithmetic undone. Her script worked everywhere in England except in this one room, and she understood, at last and too late, that she had spent her cruelty on a woman the Duke had grieved for 9 years. He did not gloat. He did not humiliate her further. He simply turned from the dowager as one turns from weather, and looked only at Clara, and waited, because for the first time in 9 years, the choice was not his to make alone. Clara Bramwell stood in the center of the brightest room in the county, with 200 faces turned toward her and the man from the smoke holding her hand, and she found that the thing she had practiced for 9 years, the making of her face into a closed door, had simply fallen away and would not be summoned back. She did not curtsy. She looked up at him, at the line of his jaw she had carried since she was 17, and she said the one honest thing she had not been able to afford to say until this moment. "You rode on," she said softly. "I have known your face for 9 years. I did not think you would ever know mine." "I did not stop," he said. The same 4 words, Aloud now the paint made flesh. I have never once stopped. The library, an hour past midnight, after the carriages had gone, and the candles had been let burn down. Snow fell past the tall window in slow, steady drift, and the fire had settled to a deep red glow. And Clara sat in the wing chair that had been his, wrapped in a coat too large for her, and the Duke sat on the hearth beside her like a man who had at last set down something he had carried too far and too long. He had given her the miniature. It lay open in her palm, the painted girl of 17, looking up at the woman of 26 she had become, and Clara turned it in the firelight and looked at the 4 scarred words on the back, and found she could read them now without the old heat in her throat. "You painted this from memory," she said. "Badly," he said. "The hair is wrong. I never saw you in daylight." He looked at her. The real face, the daylight face he had waited 9 years to be given. "I will have a better one made from life. It will take some sitting." "I have time," Clara said. It was very nearly a joke. From him, something that was very nearly a smile. They sat a long while without speaking, which was its own kind of speaking. The fire ticked and settled. Somewhere above them, the great house was quieting, room by room, as the last of the candles were put out, the snow at the tall window thickening the silence, until it seemed the 2 of them were the only waking souls in the whole White County. He told her at last, and in few words, the part she had not known, that he had searched the parish records the year after the fire, and found a Bramwell girl listed among the lost, the clerk's error never corrected, and had stopped looking because there had seemed nothing left to look for. He told her he had had the miniature painted in his 2nd year of grief, from a face he could already feel slipping, and had carried it since the way a man carries a stone in his pocket, to remind himself the ground is real. Clara listened and did not interrupt, and when he had finished, she did not offer him comfort in words because she understood that what he had needed for 9 years was not to be comforted, but to be found. In the morning the house would wake to a changed order, and the dowager would depart in her 4 trunks with her arithmetic in pieces, and the county would talk of nothing else until Lent. None of that belonged to this hour. This hour belonged only to the small, warm library and the snow at the window and the 2 of them, and the worn miniature open in her hand, the painted ghost and the living woman finally in the same firelight. No longer 2 people, but one seen at last by the one whose seeing she had waited for through every cold and unremembered year. She closed the case gently and held it against her, over her own heart now, where it had lived so long over his. Outside the snow kept falling on the gravel of the great court, covering the place in the great court where he had once stepped down from his carriage and passed her without knowing her, the place where she had folded her gloved hands against the cold and watched him climb the steps and forget her, and he would never again pass her so. Thank you for staying until the end. If Clara's long wait moved you, leave a comment with the moment that found you, and stay close for the next story.